She showed up at a stranger's door in the middle of a Wyoming blizzard, holding a baby that wasn't supposed to exist. No husband, no references, no explanation good enough. The man who answered that door had buried a wife, a son, and every reason he ever had to let someone in. He wasn't looking for a cook, he wasn't looking for anything. But the storm had other plans. What followed wasn't a love story. Not at first. It was a fight. For shelter, for dignity, for a little girl's future. And not everyone was going to walk away from it whole. If this story finds you tonight, drop your city in the comments and hit that like button. Let's see how far this reaches. The advertisement had been folded and unfolded so many times that the paper had gone soft at the creases, the ink fading along the edges where Mara's thumb had worn a pale groove into the words. She'd found it tacked to the general store board in Lander 3 weeks ago, half hidden behind a notice for a lost mule and a church supper announcement. Cook wanted. Blackstone Ranch. Room and board provided. Inquire in writing to S. Ashcroft, Fremont County. She'd torn it down before anyone else could. She'd written the letter that same evening, by candlelight, at the small table in the back room of the boarding house where she and Lily had been living on the last of her money. She'd been careful about what she said, and more careful about what she didn't. She did not mention Lily. The reply came faster than she expected, a single paragraph in a handwriting that looked like it had been trained in a schoolhouse and then mostly forgotten. Position available. Arrive before first hard snow. Do not be late. No pleasantries. No questions. She took it as an invitation. That had been her first mistake. The wagon road up to Blackstone Ranch turned to mud somewhere around the 4th mile, and the driver, a weathered man named Doss who hauled feed and mail between Lander and the outlying properties, had already made his feelings clear about the late season and the darkening sky. "You sure about this?" he said, not for the first time. "I'm sure," Mara said, not looking at him. Lily was asleep against her chest, bundled inside Mara's coat, with only her small nose and the top of her head visible. 8 months old. Heavy the way only healthy babies were heavy. A solid, urgent weight that demanded to be held. Mara kept one arm around her and braced the other against the wagon bench as they lurched through a rut. "Ranch like that, they don't usually take on women," Doss said. He wasn't being unkind, just honest the way old men in Wyoming got honest when they thought there was still time to stop you from doing something foolish. Silas Ashcroft runs a tight operation. Mostly men. Hard men. The advertisement said cook. It did. Doesn't mean he was thinking of a woman when he wrote it. Mara looked out at the land. The grass had gone pale yellow, bent flat by wind that had been blowing for 2 days. The mountains ahead wore fresh white on their upper ridges. The sky behind them, to the northwest, had the color of a bruise, that particular dark purple that riders and farmers in this part of the country learned to read before they learned to read anything else. "How long until that hits?" she asked. Doss didn't even look up. "Tonight. Maybe sooner." Mara tucked the blanket tighter around Lily's shoulders. She smelled the ranch before she saw it. Wood smoke and horses, and the faint copper smell of butchered meat that clung to working properties no matter how much you tried to air them out. Then the road crested a low ridge, and there it was below them. A main house built from dark timber, a long bunkhouse set back 40 yards. A barn, and several outbuildings. The whole thing ringed by a pole fence that had been repaired so many times in so many different places it looked like a patchwork quilt. It wasn't beautiful, but it was solid. There was a difference. Doss pulled the wagon to a stop near the front of the main house and didn't offer to help her down. She climbed off carefully with Lily still bundled against her, retrieved her worn leather suitcase from the wagon bed, and dropped it in the mud because there was no dignified way to carry both. "Good luck to you," Doss said, and meant it the way people meant things they didn't expect to do any good. He turned the wagon around before she reached the porch. She knocked twice. The door opened on the second knock as though he'd been standing near it, and the man who looked out at her was not what she'd built in her mind during 3 weeks of anticipation. Silas Ashcroft was somewhere in his late 30s, though the lines at the corners of his eyes and the set of his jaw made him look older in certain lights. He was tall, broader through the chest than the average ranch hand, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a beard he trimmed but didn't fuss over. His hands, she noticed immediately, were the hands of a man who worked alongside his crew. Scarred across the knuckles, the skin rough and dry from the cold. He looked at her. He looked at the bundle against her chest. His expression didn't change exactly. It just closed, like a shutter pulled over a window. "Mr. Ashcroft," she said, "I'm Mara Ellison. I wrote to you about the cook position." A beat of silence. Wind moved between them, carrying the first sharp edge of what was coming from the northwest. "You wrote about the cook position," he said. "You didn't write about that." "No," she said. "I didn't." "Why not?" She'd thought about how to answer this. She'd thought about it for 3 weeks. In the end, she'd decided the honest answer was the only one that had any chance. "Because you wouldn't have replied." Silas Ashcroft looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked past her at the sky, and whatever he saw there made something tighten around his eyes. "I can't hire a woman with an infant," he said. "This is a working cattle ranch. I have 15 men on this property. The kitchen work starts before 4 in the morning and it doesn't stop until after dark. There's no room in that schedule for a baby, and there's no room in this house for—" He stopped himself, recalibrated. "I'm sorry you came all this way. I genuinely am, but I can't help you." He started to close the door. "She sleeps through the night," Mara said. "She has since she was 6 weeks old. She won't be in your kitchen. She'll be where I can see her, but she won't be underfoot. I can give you 3 meals a day for 15 men, plus baking, plus preserving whatever stock you still have before winter locks everything down. I don't need much space. I don't need much of anything." She paused. "And I'm a better cook than whoever you had before." He stopped with the door half closed. "What makes you say that?" "Because you posted an advertisement in October. If your last cook had been any good, he'd have stayed." Something shifted in his face. Not warmth, not yet, but a reluctant reconsideration, the way a man looked when an argument landed somewhere he hadn't expected. He glanced again at the sky. "The storm's going to hit tonight," he said. "I know. You can't ride back to town in it." "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him working through it. The inconvenience against the alternative, whatever calculations a man like this made when life handed him a problem he hadn't built a category for. Finally, he pulled the door open and stepped back. "One night," he said. "Until the road clears, that's all I'm agreeing to." "That's all I'm asking for," she said. She picked up her suitcase and walked inside. Tid. The kitchen was a disaster. Not dirty, exactly. It had been cleaned, but cleaned the way men cleaned things, which meant the surfaces were wiped, but nothing beneath the surfaces had been touched in months. The wood stove was caked with old grease along the sides, and the left burner ran hot because it hadn't been adjusted since whenever the last cook had figured that out and kept the knowledge to himself. Pots were stacked without any particular logic. The pantry shelves held food in no discernible order. Dried beans next to lamp oil, cornmeal pushed to the back behind a rusted tin of something with no label. She set Lily's travel basket near the far wall, away from drafts and away from the stove. Lily was awake now, blinking at the unfamiliar ceiling with the serene attention of a baby who had been in enough unfamiliar places that she'd stopped being startled by them. Mara tucked the blanket around her and turned to assess the room. She had 2 hours before the ranch hands would be expecting supper. She started with the stove. Tasi. She learned the names of the men in stages, the way you learned anything in a place that wasn't ready to give itself away. The first one through the kitchen door that evening was a cowboy named Hitch, short for Hitchcock, which he'd caught from his mother's affection for a great-uncle nobody else in the family remembered. He was somewhere around 20, with a raw-boned face and a way of moving like he was always half expecting to be told to do something else. He stopped dead in the kitchen doorway and looked at Lily and her basket, then at Mara at the stove, then back at Lily. "Well," he said. "Supper's in 40 minutes, Mara told him. "Go wash your hands." He went. The next through the door was a man named Cole Breckett, the ranch foreman, who had the wide, flat face of someone who'd broken his nose at least twice and the kind of quiet authority that didn't need to announce itself. He took in the scene with the unhurried evaluation of a man who'd spent 20 years deciding whether things were problems or not. "You the cook Silas hired?" he asked. "Silas didn't hire me," she said. "We're in a trial period." Cole Breckett looked at her for a moment, then at the baby, then at the steam rising from the pot on the stove. "What are you making?" Beef stew with biscuits, and there's a gingerbread in the oven if nobody burns the place down in the next half hour. He raised his eyebrows a fraction of an inch. Gingerbread. Gingerbread, she confirmed. He turned and walked back out without another word, and she heard him on the porch telling someone to go back and actually wash their hands this time because there was a woman in the kitchen and basic decency hadn't entirely left the earth. Supper was the first real test, and she knew it. 15 men filed into the dining room in varying states of cleanliness and varying states of skepticism. They took their seats with the cautious uncertainty of people who'd learned not to expect too much from any cook they hadn't hired themselves. Silas Ashcroft sat at the head of the table and said nothing. He'd been absent from the kitchen since she arrived, and she'd been glad for that. One less person to navigate while she was still finding where everything was kept. She brought out the stew first, then the biscuits, then went back for the gravy boat and the sliced pickled beets she'd found in the far back of the pantry. Still good, still tangy. She set everything on the table without ceremony. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Hitch reached for the ladle, and that broke whatever spell had been holding them, and they all reached at once the way hungry men do when something finally smells the way they'd hoped it would. The room got quiet. Not the quiet of discomfort, but the quiet of eating. Real eating, focused and grateful. Silas tasted the stew. He didn't say anything. He ate the biscuit. He reached for a second one, which was the kind of review that didn't require words. At the end of the table, an old cowhand named Purdy, who Hitch had told her in a whispered aside, was the most difficult man on the property to please on account of 20 years of opinions about food, mopped his bowl with his last piece of biscuit, and looked up at Mara where she stood near the kitchen doorway. "Where'd you learn to cook?" he asked. "My mother," she said, and after that, necessity. He nodded slowly like a man confirming something he'd already suspected. "Well," he said, and returned to his bowl. She went back into the kitchen to check on Lily and to cut the gingerbread, and she let herself breathe for the first time in hours. Peska. The storm hit at 9 that night. It came the way Wyoming storms came in October. Not gradually, not with warning, but all at once, like the sky had been holding its breath and simply decided to stop. The wind went from a cold draft to a howl in the space of 20 minutes, and by 10 o'clock the snow was horizontal against the windows and the temperature had dropped enough to put frost on the inside of the glass. Mara lay on the narrow cot in the small room Silas had indicated with a minimal gesture. That one, at the end of the hall, with Lily asleep in the basket beside her, and listened to the house creak against the wind. She could hear the bunkhouse from here, that faraway communal sound of men sleeping, coughing, settling. She could hear one of the horses in the barn. She could hear the wind doing something to the eaves that it would do for the next several hours. She was not going anywhere tomorrow, possibly not the day after. She'd known this when she walked through the door, and she suspected Silas had known it too, and that knowledge had been a kind of unspoken negotiation between them, neither one saying the obvious thing, both of them letting the weather make the decision that was too complicated to make any other way. Lily stirred in her sleep, made a small sound, settled back. Mara put her hand on the basket's edge in the dark. She was 26 years old. She had $11 left in the pocket of her coat, a suitcase with less in it than it looked like it held, and a child she was responsible for in a way that had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with a promise she'd made to a dying woman in a Kansas City boarding house 7 months ago. She thought about that promise sometimes, in the small hours, when the dark was heavy enough that pretending became too much work. "Take care of her. You're the only one I trust with this." Clara had said that. Clara, who had been 22 and too sick to be 22, and who had looked at Mara with eyes that already knew what was coming. Clara, who had loved her daughter with a ferocity that made it impossible to say no. Mara had not said no. She still didn't know some nights if that made her brave or just unable to walk away from things that needed someone to stay. The snow was still coming at dawn. She didn't let it stop her. She was in the kitchen before 4, stoking the stove, working through the pantry with the systematic attention of someone taking inventory while also figuring out how to turn what was there into enough food for the day. She'd found a side of salt pork she could use, potatoes going slightly soft but still usable, dried apples that would do something in a pot with sugar and cinnamon. She was cracking eggs into a bowl when Silas Ashcroft appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was dressed but barely, flannel shirt, suspenders not yet over his shoulders, the kind of half-dressed state that meant he'd woken up and come straight here rather than anywhere else. He stopped when he saw her, a coffee cup in his hand that turned out to be empty. She pointed at the pot on the stove without looking up from the eggs. Coffee's been ready since 4:30. He crossed the kitchen, poured himself a cup, and stood near the window looking out at the white. The snow was still heavy. You couldn't see the bunkhouse from here. Road'll be closed for at least 2 days, he said. Maybe 3. I know. That's not what we agreed to. She set down the bowl and looked at him. He was watching her with an expression she was starting to recognize. Not hostile, exactly, but careful. The look of a man who'd learned that most things he opened himself up to eventually cost him something. You can put me and Lily in the barn if it would make you more comfortable, she said. We've slept in worse, but I'm going to cook for your men regardless, because they need to eat and because it's what I'm here to do. You don't have to make it formal. You don't have to call it a job. But I'm going to do the work. He drank his coffee. He looked out at the snow. The barn is cold, he said finally. Yes. Colder than this room. Yes. He turned the cup in his hands. There's flour in the storeroom, second shelf. More than you found in here. He paused. And the left burner on that stove runs hot. Compensate or everything you put on that side will burn. I figured that out last night, she said. He looked at her again. Something in his face. Not quite a concession, but the shape of one. 3 days, he said. That's what the storm is giving us. We'll figure out the rest after. He took his coffee and walked back out of the kitchen. Mara turned back to the eggs. 3 days. She could do a great deal with 3 days. The snow held, and then it held some more. By the third morning, the drifts along the fence line were chest high, and the temperature hadn't risen above 10 degrees. Doss would not be coming. No one was going anywhere. Mara settled into the kitchen the way she settled into everything. Methodically, practically, with a thoroughness that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with the simple fact that if she didn't do it right, there would be consequences. And consequences in her life had generally been swift and unforgiving. The men began to adjust to her presence in the way that herds adjusted to a new thing. First with wariness, then with curiosity, then with a kind of proprietary warmth that surprised her a little. Hitch started appearing in the kitchen an hour before supper on the pretense of needing something from the pantry, which was transparent but harmless. He sat on the stool near the far counter and talked while she cooked. Not about anything in particular, just the kind of talk that filled a room when a person was lonely in a way they weren't entirely aware of. He'd come from Nebraska, he said. His mother was still there. He sent her money when he had it. You got family somewhere? He asked her once. No, she said. He nodded and didn't push it. She appreciated that. Cole Breckett, the foreman, was more useful than friendly. He started leaving brief notes on the kitchen table. Low on salt pork, need to check the root cellar. Purdy has a bad tooth and can't chew anything hard, which she took as his version of inclusion. She wrote back on the same paper, brief and practical, a working correspondence that suited them both. Purdy himself remained a skeptic, but a softening one. On the 4th day, she made him soft cornbread soaked in honey butter, easy on the jaw, and when he finished it, he looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating an opinion he'd held too long. Fine, he said. I'm glad, she said. Don't make something of it, he said. Wouldn't dream of it, she said, and turned back to the stove. Silas Ashcroft was the hardest to read, because he tried the least to be read. He was not unkind. She wanted to be clear about that in her own mind, because she'd encountered unkind men and knew the difference. He was something more complicated, a man who had organized his life with great deliberateness around the minimum amount of attachment, who had looked at what connections could cost and decided the math didn't work. He ran his ranch with a discipline that his men respected, spoke when he had something to say, and stopped when he didn't, and maintained a distance from everything personal that had clearly been in place for a long time. She learned some of what he'd lost from Hitch, who told her in the careful way of someone who liked the person in question and didn't want to say too much. A wife, 8 years ago. A son, the same year. The boy had come too early and not stayed. The kind of grief that arrived in pairs, which was the worst kind, because you couldn't finish mourning the first before the second was already demanding its share of you. She didn't change how she was with him after she knew that. She didn't soften her voice or avoid certain subjects or do any of the things people sometimes did when they learned a person was carrying something. She just kept doing what she was doing, fed his men, ran his kitchen, made sure there was coffee when he came through in the morning, and that the house smelled like something warm and alive every evening before the crew came in. It was not calculated. She didn't have the energy for calculation. It was just what she knew to do with a space that needed tending. Thought. Lily took to the ranch the way babies took to things they encountered before they'd learned to be afraid of them, with complete openness, with delight, with the kind of uncomplicated engagement that made adults feel, briefly, like they'd forgotten something important. On the morning of the 5th day, Mara had Lily in the kitchen with her, propped in the basket on the table where Mara could see her while she worked, and Hitch came through the door to find a coffee cup and stopped dead at the sight of the baby waving a wooden spoon she'd somehow obtained. "Where'd she get that?" he asked. "I have no idea," Mara said, which was true. Hitch sat down across from Lily, and she fixed him with the solemn, undiscriminating attention of someone who had not yet learned to be impressed by or frightened of anyone. Then she held out the spoon. He took it from her carefully, like it was something fragile. "Hey there," he said, in the voice people used with babies. Softer, slower, a voice they didn't use for anything else. Lily considered him. Then she reached for his finger. Something moved across Hitch's face that he didn't have a word for and didn't try to name. He sat there for a while with the baby holding his finger and didn't get his coffee and didn't seem to notice. This happened with the other men in their own ways and on their own schedules. Old Purdy, who claimed to have no patience for children, spent 20 minutes one afternoon talking to Lily in a low, grumbling monologue about the proper way to maintain a fence line, apparently because she was the only one who would listen without arguing. Two of the younger hands, brothers named Glenn and Roy from somewhere in Missouri, whittled her a small wooden horse over the course of a week and presented it with a formality that exceeded any occasion it needed. Their hats in their hands, their faces red. Roy saying we made this for the baby as though clarification was necessary. She kept it on the windowsill in her room, that horse. She looked at it sometimes in the evening after Lily was down and thought about how strange it was. The things that could grow in unlikely soil, the places warmth turned up when you weren't looking for it. She found Silas in the barn on the 7th day, working on a damaged section of stall that had taken some damage in the storm. She'd come to ask about the smokehouse, whether there was still salt in it, whether the door was sealing properly, and found him mid-repair, one knee on the ground, a mouthful of nails. He took the nails out of his mouth before speaking, which she appreciated. "Smokehouse key is on the hook by the back door," he said. "Should be enough salt. The seal on the door is only good on the right side now. Don't let it swing fully open or you'll lose the alignment." "Thank you." She paused. "You're good with that," she said, indicating the repair. He looked at what he was doing. "Had to learn." "Everybody on this ranch had to learn everything," she said. "That's the part that gets me. There's not a single thing here that came easy." He sat back on his heels and looked at her with a directness she hadn't yet gotten used to. "Nothing comes easy out here." "No," she agreed. "But some people think that means it's not worth building." He was quiet for a moment. A horse shifted in the next stall. Wind moved along the barn roof. "Some people have reasons for thinking that," he said. His voice was level, but there was something beneath it. Not self-pity, nothing so soft as that. Just the flat acknowledgement of a fact he'd lived with long enough to be tired of. "I know," she said. She didn't say anything else. She didn't try to argue him out of whatever weight he was carrying, because you couldn't argue people out of weight. You could only be around when they needed to put it down for a moment. She thanked him again for the smokehouse information and left him to his repair, and she didn't look back because she understood instinctively that a man like Silas Ashcroft needed not to be watched when he was being seen. On the 10th day, the weather broke. The temperature climbed above freezing for the first time since the storm, and by afternoon the snow was dropping in heavy slides off the barn roof, and the icicles along the eaves were dripping steadily. The road to town would be passable within a day, maybe two. Mara was standing at the kitchen window watching the thaw when Cole Breckett came through the back door, knocked the mud off his boots, and stood in the kitchen with the careful manner of a man who'd decided to say something he'd spent time thinking about. "We could use a cook," he said. "Proper, not temporary." She turned from the window. That's not your decision to make. No, he agreed. But Silas listens to me when I bother to say something worth hearing, and I don't bother often. He picked up his hat from where he'd hung it and turned it in his hands. You're good for this place. The men are easier. The house smells like something other than smoke and boot leather. He paused. We haven't eaten this well since before Margaret. She didn't ask who Margaret was. He put his hat back on. I just figured you should know that somebody noticed, he said, and went back out. But Silas came to her that evening after the crew had eaten, and the kitchen was cleaned, and Lily was asleep down the hall. She was at the table with a cup of tea and the household ledger he'd left out for her. She'd taken to noting the pantry inventory, a practical measure that nobody had asked her to do, but that seemed useful. He stood in the doorway for a moment, reading the room, and then he came in and sat down across from her. He didn't bring coffee. He just sat. The road'll be passable day after tomorrow, he said. I know. He was quiet for a while. She didn't fill the silence because she'd learned in the past 10 days that Silas Ashcroft's silences were not vacuums. They were processing. They were deliberation. They were him being honest with himself before he was honest out loud. I'm not an easy man to work for, he said finally. I keep my own counsel, and I don't explain myself much, and I run this place a certain way that doesn't bend easily. I noticed, she said. Something moved in his expression, close to dry amusement, closer than she'd expected. I need a cook who can stay through winter, not a week, not until the next storm passes. Through. The whole winter is 12, 13 weeks yet, and spring comes hard and there's more work then, not less. She set down her pen. I know what a Wyoming winter is. And the child. Lily, she said. Her name is Lily. He didn't flinch from that. Lily. She'll need things. Space, attention. She's going to be walking before spring, probably. This isn't a ranch built for... He stopped. For what? She asked, steadily, not a challenge. He looked at the table for a moment, then back up at her. For a family, he said. I didn't build it for that. What did you build it for? He seemed genuinely startled by the question, as if no one had asked it directly before. Work, he said. Work and... He stopped again. I don't know, he said, and it sounded true. Not evasive, genuinely uncertain, the way a man sounded when he'd avoided a question for so long that discovering he no longer had an answer surprised him. You can pay me what the position is worth, Mara said. Whatever you were paying the last one, or what's fair, I don't need more than that. I need the room, I need Lily to stay with me, and I need not to be managed like a problem that you're enduring. Past that, I'm straightforward to work with. He looked at her for a long moment. $60 a month, he said. Room and board. You eat what the crew eats. $60 is generous. It's what the work is worth. He stood up. The storeroom's yours to manage. Order what you need through Cole. If you have concerns about the kitchen, tell me directly. Don't work around it. Understood. He walked toward the door, and then he stopped without turning around. His hand was on the door frame, and the lamp threw his shadow long across the floor. I lost someone, he said, a few years back. Not recent. I want you to understand that I'm not... He stopped, started again. This is a job. That's what I need from it. That's what I need from it too, Mara said. She said it simply, without weight, because it was what he needed to hear, and because it wasn't entirely untrue. Good night, Mr. Ashcroft. Silas, he said, you might as well. He went to bed. She sat for a while longer with her tea in the ledger, and outside the icicles dripped their steady percussion against the frozen ground, and the ranch that had been quiet for so long made its small sounds around her, the creak of settling timber, the wind finding its way around corners, the distant huff of horses in the barn, and she thought that it didn't sound so much like a place that had given up on itself. It sounded like a place that had just been waiting for someone to stay. Winter settled over Blackstone Ranch the way it always did in Wyoming, not as a guest, but as an occupation. It moved in and spread itself through every corner of the property, thickened the air, shortened the days until the light felt like a loan that got called in too early. By mid-November, the temperature at dawn was hitting 20 below, and the snow on the flat ground had compacted into a hard, gray crust that crunched under boots like broken glass. Mara stopped thinking about leaving somewhere around the end of her third week. Not because the situation had resolved itself into something comfortable, it hadn't, not entirely, but because the rhythm of the work had taken over in the way that hard physical work eventually did, crowding out the space where uncertainty lived. She was up before 4 every morning. She had coffee on before the crew stirred. She fed 15 men breakfast, sent them out into the cold, managed the kitchen through the day, fed them again at noon if weather kept them close, and had supper on the table by 6. In between, she managed the pantry inventory, corresponded with the dry goods supplier in Lander through Cole, put up the last of the autumn preserves, and kept Lily from dismantling whatever portion of the kitchen she could reach from her basket. It was relentless, and she was good at relentless. What she hadn't expected was the way the men would fold Lily into the fabric of the place as if she'd always been there. It started small. Hitch had taken to stopping by the kitchen in the mornings to make faces at her while Mara worked, a performance that reliably produced the particular gummy laugh that Lily had recently discovered she possessed and that could stop a grown man mid-sentence. Glenn and Roy, the brothers from Missouri, had graduated from the wooden horse to a set of carved blocks with letters on them, presented with the same grave ceremony as before, Roy explaining that letters were important because you don't want to end up unable to read your own contracts. Practical wisdom, delivered to a 9-month-old with complete sincerity. Even Purdy had stopped pretending to be unaffected. Mara caught him once, through the kitchen window, sitting on the porch steps with Lily in his lap, pointing at things and naming them in his low, unhurried voice. That there's the barn. That's a magpie. That's the water trough. Don't touch it. It's froze. When he noticed Mara watching, he gave her a look that dared her to comment. She turned back to her work and said nothing, which was the right answer, and he was back the next afternoon. It did something to the men, having her there. Not in any way Mara could have calculated or planned for. It was more like something had been missing from the property for long enough that people had stopped noticing the absence. And now that it was back, they didn't have words for what had returned, but they felt it in the way they felt the change in their own behavior. They were quieter at the table in the good way, not the sullen way. Arguments that would have flared up in a bunkhouse full of stir-crazy cowboys in previous winters seemed to dissipate faster, as if the presence of something small and undefended in the house imposed a kind of restraint that no foreman's authority could quite manage. Cole noticed it. He didn't say much about it, but he noticed. He mentioned it once to Mara in his typically clipped fashion, standing in the kitchen doorway with his coat still on, having come in from the cold to drop off her weekly supply list. Men are easier, he said. You said that before, she told him, not looking up from the biscuit dough. Worth saying twice. He stood there a moment longer than was necessary for a man who'd delivered what he came to deliver. You doing all right? He asked. With all of it. The work, He gestured vaguely in the direction of Lily, who was on her back in her basket, making a study of her own hands. Mara thought about the honest answer, which was complicated, and gave him the practical one instead. I'm doing fine, Cole. He nodded once, like she'd confirmed a suspicion, and went back out. Silas was around more than she'd expected, and in ways she didn't anticipate. He was not a man who hovered or intruded. She'd established that early. But a working ranch in winter kept its owner close to the buildings, and close to the buildings meant passing through the kitchen with a regularity that gradually stopped feeling incidental. He came through for coffee in the mornings. Sometimes he ate breakfast at the kitchen table rather than the dining room if the crew had already cleared out, which turned out to be a preference rather than a concession, and she stopped making a fuss about setting a separate place for him, and just made sure there was always something on the stove. They talked in those mornings. Not in the way people talked when they were trying to get to know each other, not that deliberately, but in the sideways manner of two people who worked in proximity and found it unnatural to be entirely silent. Ranch logistics, mostly. The roof over the east stall that needed work before the next heavy snow. The supply order that had come in short on flour. Whether the well pump was going to hold through February or whether they needed to get a man up to look at it before it became urgent. Practical things, safe things. But the practical things accumulated, and what accumulated became something she couldn't quite name, which was the shape of a person. She learned that he'd built the main house himself, with 3 hired hands over the course of a summer 14 years ago, that he'd grown up in Pennsylvania, which surprised her, and that the accent had been worked out of his voice by so many years in Wyoming that nothing of it remained except occasionally, when he was tired, a particular flatness in certain vowels, that he could fix almost anything mechanical on the property but had never once successfully baked anything, a limitation he disclosed with the same matter-of-fact quality he brought to everything else, as if it were just a property specification. "I tried once," he said one morning, without context, watching her pull a pan of cornbread from the oven. "Tried what?" "Baking. For a while, I was cooking for myself and the crew." He stopped. She understood what the pause covered and didn't push through it. "I made something that was supposed to be bread. It came out like a roof tile. Purdy tried to eat it, and I think he genuinely could not." "What went wrong?" "I don't know. I followed the recipe." "You can follow a recipe and still get it wrong," she said. "Baking needs you to pay attention to the thing you're making, not just the instructions. If the dough isn't right, the instructions stop mattering." He looked at the cornbread for a moment. "That seems like a lot of judgment for something that should just be chemistry." "Most things people call chemistry are actually judgment," she said, and handed him a piece. He ate it standing at the counter and didn't say anything else about it. But something in the silence afterward was different from the silences that had preceded it. Less defended, slightly less careful, as if a door had been left open a crack that hadn't been opened before. She noticed. She told herself to stop noticing. Lily pulled herself upright for the first time on a Sunday in late November. She'd been working toward it for days, gripping whatever came to hand and hauling herself halfway up before losing her nerve and dropping back down. On this particular morning, she grabbed the leg of the kitchen table and, with a determination that was frankly alarming in something that size, got herself vertical and stayed there. She looked around the kitchen with the expression of someone who had dramatically revised their understanding of the world. "Oh," Mara said from across the room. "Just that." Lily looked at her. "Well," Mara said. "There you are." She stood there 3 seconds before sitting down abruptly on her own terms, which was its own kind of accomplishment, and Mara laughed, really laughed, with her whole chest, the kind of laugh that didn't happen often enough in her life, and crossed the room and picked Lily up and held her for a moment in the middle of the kitchen just because she needed to. It was at that moment that Silas appeared in the kitchen doorway, on his way from the barn, and stopped at the sight of them. Lily, from over Mara's shoulder, noticed him and reached both hands in his direction with the unambiguous demand of someone used to getting picked up. Something happened in Silas's face. It was brief, and he controlled it quickly, but it was there. A momentary loosening, a look that was complicated in a way she didn't examine too closely. "She stood up," Mara said. "Just now, on her own." "I see that." He crossed the kitchen and let Lily grab his thumb, which she did immediately with her full grip, and he looked down at her with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite managing. "She's growing fast." "Too fast," Mara agreed. He untangled his thumb from Lily's grip with the careful deliberateness of a man who was being deliberate about it, and straightened up and became businesslike again. "Cole needs to talk to you about the December supply order when you have a moment." "I'll find him after lunch," she said. He nodded and went out, and Mara turned back to the stove, and she absolutely did not let herself turn around and watch him walk away, because there was no version of that which led anywhere useful. "Tight days." The gossip came from town, as gossip did, carried in on the supply wagon by a driver who wasn't Doss this time, but a younger man named Featherstone who had a loose mouth and didn't always know it. Mara heard about it from Hitch, who told her with the uncomfortable directness of someone who respected her enough to think she should know. "People in town are talking," he said. He'd come to find her in the afternoon between meals when the kitchen was quieter. He stood near the door and turned his hat in his hands. "About you being here. A woman and a baby on a bachelor ranch. He stopped. "Some of it isn't kind." "I know what they're saying," she said. She was sorting dried beans, her hands moving automatically. "Let them say it." "Doesn't it bother you?" She thought about that honestly. "It bothers me that it might cause trouble for the ranch," she said. "For Silas. Gossip like that can follow a man, and he didn't—" She stopped herself. "He's been decent. I wouldn't want it to cost him something." Hitch was quiet for a moment. "He knows," he said. Featherstone didn't exactly keep his voice down. Silas heard some of it. "What did he say?" "He told Featherstone that what happened on his property was his business, and that if Featherstone had opinions about it, he could keep them on the road to town. Hitch paused. I'm paraphrasing. He was more direct than that. Mara kept sorting the beans. He's a good man, Hitch said. Not like it was news. More like he was saying it for her benefit, in case she hadn't landed there yet. I know, she said. And she did. That was the part that required managing. Was. She found out about Margaret on a night when the cold had driven everyone inside early, and the bunkhouse was settled, and she and Silas were the only ones left awake in the main house. She hadn't planned the conversation. She'd been up late working on the week's bread, large batches, 4 loaves, because she'd found that having fresh bread available between meals reduced the amount of minor irritability that accumulated among men who worked hard and ate a lot and sometimes needed something to hold them between one thing and the next. Silas came through around 9 with the look of a man who'd been over his account books and arrived at numbers he wasn't happy about. He poured coffee and sat down and said nothing for a while. She let him. You heard Cole mention Margaret, he said eventually. She hadn't expected him to bring it up. I didn't ask, she said carefully. No, you don't ask about things. He said it without criticism, just observation. He stopped. Most people ask. You tell things when you're ready to tell them, she said. I've found that's true of most people. He turned his cup in his hands. The lamp made the kitchen feel smaller than it was, more contained, and the sound of the wind outside was a constant low note that had become, over weeks, as familiar as the sound of her own breathing. My wife, he said. Margaret. She died 8 years ago. Her and the boy together, more or less. He was early, and she... He stopped. Started again differently. She was the one who wanted the house. I'd have built something smaller, practical. She wanted something that felt like a place where people would stay. He looked up at Mara. I built her what she wanted, and then she wasn't here to be in it. The fire in the stove popped once, settling. I'm sorry, Mara said. She said it the plain way, without dressing it up, because she meant it plainly. I kept running it, he said. The ranch. That's what I knew to do. Men need feeding, cattle need working, fences need fixing. You don't get to stop because you're... He shook his head. You just don't get to stop. No, she agreed. You don't. He looked at her, and for a moment she had the feeling he was about to ask her something. About Lily, about Clara, about whatever her version of that story was. But he didn't. He just looked at her with the measured attention of someone who had been paying more attention than she'd realized, and then he looked away. The bread's going to burn, he said. She turned and pulled the loaves, which had another 10 minutes, but she let it go. She set them on the rack, and they sat there in the warmth and the quiet, and neither of them said anything more that night, and somehow that was all right. December arrived, and with it the particular relentlessness of deep winter, which wore on a person differently than the novelty of the first snowstorm. The cold now was structural. It lived in the walls, in the ground, in the way you had to think about everything before you did it. Because a mistake in 20 below weather had consequences that mistakes in October didn't. Men pulled muscles straining frozen equipment. Animals had to be checked twice a day. The water situation required constant attention. Through it, Mara cooked. She developed a sense of the crew's moods the way a person developed any useful knowledge. Through close attention over time. She knew when Hitch was missing his mother because he got quieter than usual and started moving things on the counter without purpose. She knew when Cole was worried about something he hadn't told anyone because he started double-checking things he'd already checked. She knew when Purdy's tooth was bad because he ate slower and got sharper, and she made softer things on those days without announcing why. She fed people the way her own mother had fed people, not just for the calorie and the warmth, but because cooking was one of the ways she knew to say things that didn't have a direct language. On bad days, she made something with more labor in it. Pies, proper stews that took hours, bread with extra care. On good days, she made something simpler and let them come to it themselves. The crew ate without analyzing why some meals felt like more than meals. But they felt it, and it showed in the ease that settled over the dining table by mid-December, in the way arguments blew through faster, in the way the men had started wishing Lily good morning by name when they came through and didn't find it strange. One Thursday evening, 2 weeks before Christmas, Hitch found an old fiddle in the bunkhouse that someone had left behind years ago and started playing it after supper with the apologetic air of someone who was decent but not good and knew it. But it was music, which the ranch hadn't had in a long time, and the crew sat around after the meal without dispersing, which they also hadn't done in a long time, and someone told a story, and someone else argued with it, and Purdy called somebody a fool with less heat than usual, and Lily sat in Mara's lap and watched the fiddle with enormous eyes. It was a small thing, the kind of small thing that wouldn't mean much in the accounting of a life, if you wrote it down. But Mara looked across the table that night and found Silas watching it, watching his men around his table with the food she'd made still on the boards between them and music in the room and the baby awake past her bedtime because the sound wouldn't let her sleep. And the expression on his face was one she recognized. It was the look of a man remembering something he'd decided he couldn't have and finding it in front of him anyway, and not quite knowing what to do with that. He caught her looking and held it for just a moment before he glanced away, and she turned back to Lily, and Hitch played a wrong note and Roy told him so, and the moment passed. But it had been there. The winter was long yet, and the house was small, and the distance between two people who had both lost things and both kept going anyway was turning out to be less fixed than either of them had planned. Christmas came and went the way it did on working ranches, quietly, without much ceremony, marked more by a slightly better meal and a half-day off than by anything that resembled the holiday as people imagined it. Mara made a roast and 2 pies, and there was whiskey passed around after supper that she pretended not to notice, and Hitch played the fiddle again, better this time, and someone had strung dried berries along the mantelpiece, which she suspected was Roy's doing, though he denied it. Silas gave her an extra month's wages, folded inside an envelope with no note, left on the kitchen table on Christmas morning. She didn't thank him out loud, and he didn't bring it up, which was the right way to handle it, and they both understood that without discussion. January arrived like a debt collector. The temperature dropped to levels that made October feel like a memory of warmth. The work got harder in the specific ways that deep winter made things harder. Ice on the water lines, horses that needed extra feed and more frequent checking, men who were tired in the bone-deep way of people who hadn't been warm in weeks. Cole's face took on the permanent set jaw of a man managing too many things and not complaining about any of them, which Mara had learned was his version of distress. She started making coffee available all day, keeping it hot, no questions. She added a second afternoon meal, nothing formal, just bread and salt pork and whatever was quick, because the men were burning more than 3 meals could replace. She didn't ask Silas's permission. She just did it. And when he noticed the change, he said nothing, which she took as approval. It was in the second week of January that she let herself understand, fully and without qualification, that she had feelings for him that were not going to be reasoned away. She didn't welcome this understanding. It arrived uninvited, the way inconvenient truths did, with the force of something that had been building long enough that denying it had become more work than acknowledging it. It arrived on a Tuesday morning when Silas came in from the cold with ice in his beard and his hands already stiff, and she poured him coffee before he asked, and he looked at her. Just looked. The ordinary look of a tired man receiving a small consideration, and something in her chest moved in a way that was entirely beyond her management. She turned back to the stove. She was practical about it, the way she was practical about most things. It was a feeling. Feelings were not plans. Silas Ashcroft had been clear about what this was: a job, a working arrangement, a transaction of labor and wages. And he had been clear about why. The man had spent 8 years building a life that could not be hurt by love, because there was no love in it to threaten. And she had spent the better part of a year learning how not to need things she couldn't have. They were alike in that way, which was perhaps part of the problem. She didn't do anything about it. She cooked his meals and managed his kitchen and argued with him occasionally about the supply orders and did not, under any circumstances, let her eyes linger on him longer than the situation required. It was an exercise in discipline that she was quietly extremely tired of by the 3rd week of January, but she maintained it because the alternative was chaos, and she had a child to raise and a winter to get through. What she didn't account for was Silas. He started finding reasons to be in the kitchen in the afternoons. It was not dramatic. He didn't announce it or change his behavior in any way that the crew would have noticed. He just began to appear, with a legitimate question about the supply list, with something that needed fixing on the pantry shelf, with the occasional cup of coffee refilled in the middle of the day when he had no particular reason to be inside. He would stay for 10 minutes, sometimes 15, talking about ranch business, or sometimes not talking about much at all, and then he would go back out. Mara noticed. She noticed with the careful, exhausting attention of someone who was watching for something they were trying not to want. On a Thursday afternoon in late January, he came in and sat down without a pretense. No list, no repair, nothing, and simply said, "Tell me about her, Lily. Where she came from." Mara was quiet for a moment, her hands in bread dough. She'd been expecting this question for months and had prepared several versions of the answer, and now that it was here, she found she didn't want any of them. Her mother was named Clara Voss, she said. "I knew her in Kansas City. She was sick when I met her, already past the point of getting better. Lily's father had left by then, before Clara even knew about the baby. He had a wife somewhere east, which nobody told Clara until it was too late to matter. She worked the dough. Clara had nobody. Her family had cut her off when she followed the father west. So she was alone in a boarding house with no money and a baby coming and a body that was failing on her." "How did you know her?" "I was living in the same house. I'd been there 6 months, working in the hotel kitchen down the street." She paused. "We used to sit in the parlor in the evenings. She was funny. You wouldn't expect it, looking at her toward the end, but she had a wicked sense of humor, and she laughed at things other people missed. I liked her a great deal." She stopped, started again. "She asked me when Lily was 2 weeks old. She said she could see what was coming, and she needed to know Lily would be with someone who—" She stopped. "Someone who what?" "Someone who wouldn't treat her like a burden." She said it simply, without sentiment, because that was the word Clara had used. "I've been a burden to enough people in my life, and I won't have her be one to anyone. You don't see her that way." "I can tell." Silas was quiet for a long moment. Mara kept working the dough because it needed working and because having something to do with her hands made things easier. "You gave up your job," he said, "your room, to take a child that wasn't yours." "Clara was my friend," she said, "and Lily needed someone." "That's not a small thing you did." "It felt small at the time," she said. "It felt like the only available thing." She shaped the loaf and set it aside. "I wasn't doing well in Kansas City anyway. There had been someone before. It didn't work out, and I'd spent about a year not knowing what to do with myself. Taking Lily felt like something to do that mattered. I don't know if that's noble or just needing a purpose." "I think it's both," he said. "Usually is." She looked at him then, because the plainness of it surprised her. He was watching her with a steadiness she'd come to associate with him, not performing attention, just genuinely paying it. "She's lucky it was you," he said. Mara turned back to the dough. "I'm lucky it was her," she said. "Lily's the one keeping me from being completely unmoored. That's the part I don't say much." He didn't respond to that, but the silence after it was a different kind of silence, fuller than most. And when he got up to leave a few minutes later, his hand rested briefly on the back of the chair he'd been sitting in. A small, unnecessary gesture, not quite touching anything. And then he went. "Yes." The letter arrived on the 2nd of February. It came in with the supply wagon, buried under a stack of correspondence for Silas, and it was addressed to Mara in a handwriting she didn't recognize. Formal, deliberate letters, the handwriting of someone who had learned to write for official purposes. The return address was a law firm in Topeka, Kansas, Graff and Hollis, attorneys at law. She read it in the kitchen after the lunch dishes were done, standing at the counter because she didn't sit down until she'd read it twice and understood what it meant, and by then sitting down felt beside the point. The letter informed her that Mr. and Mrs. Everett Holbrook of Topeka, Kansas, were the maternal great-uncle and great-aunt of one Lillian Voss, aged 9 months, currently in the informal custody of one Mara Ellison. Mr. and Mrs. Holbrook had recently become aware of the child's existence and were prepared to assert their legal claim to guardianship. Furthermore, the letter noted, Lily Voss was the inheritor of a land parcel in eastern Kansas, left in her name by her late father as part of a property settlement, a parcel estimated at value not less than $4,000. And the Holbrook family believed strongly that such an inheritance required the management and stewardship of appropriate family rather than an unattached woman of uncertain means and no legal standing. That last phrase she read 3 times. Unattached woman of uncertain means and no legal standing. She set the letter on the counter and looked at Lily, who was in her basket working seriously on the wooden horse the brothers had made, turning it over and over with the methodical attention of someone conducting an investigation. $4,000. Land in Kansas. Clara had never said a word about it, had either not known or known and said nothing, which was its own kind of thing to think about. And now the Holbrooks, whoever they were, had found out. Mara's hands were steady when she picked the letter back up. She was good in crises, had always been. The panic came later, in the small hours, when the immediate thing was already being dealt with. Right now, the immediate thing was dealing with this. She was still standing there, reading it a fourth time, when Silas came through the back door. He read it once, standing beside her, and she watched his face while he read it. His expression didn't shift dramatically. He had the kind of face that didn't, which she'd learned to read past. The tightening around the jaw, the slight compression of his mouth, were, for Silas Ashcroft, equivalent to what other men might show with a great deal more noise. "Holbrook," he said. "Do you know them?" "No." Clara never mentioned a great-uncle. "The land," he said. "Did you know?" "No." He set the letter on the counter. "You have any documentation? The arrangement with Clara? Was any of it written?" "She wrote a letter," Mara said. "Witnessed by the boarding house owner and 2 other residents. It states clearly that she wanted Lily in my care. I've kept it." "Good. Get it." He picked up his coat from the hook by the door. "I'm going to find Cole." "Why Cole?" "Because Cole's brother is a lawyer in Cheyenne and I'm going to write him today." He shrugged the coat on. "And because I need to think about something, and I think better moving." He went out. Mara stood in the kitchen for a moment in the particular stillness of a person who has just watched someone else take their problem seriously, which was a stillness she hadn't had occasion to feel in a long time. Then she went to get Clara's letter from the lining of her suitcase, where she'd kept it for 7 months, folded careful as a deed, because some part of her had always known she might need it. She told Hitch that night because she was going to need him and the other men to understand what might be coming, and because she trusted him to tell it to the rest of the crew in the right way. She told him in the kitchen after the house was quiet, and he listened with his hat in his hands and his face going through several things in sequence: confusion, then understanding, then a particular kind of anger that young men felt when they heard about something unfair being done to someone they'd decided to care about. "They can't just take her," he said. "Can they?" "They can try," Mara said. "The law is... it's complicated. I'm not her mother. I'm not her family. I'm a woman who has a letter from a dying woman who was also not her mother by blood, against a family with a law firm in Topeka and a claim on her inheritance." "What does Silas say?" "He's writing to Cole's brother tonight." Hitch was quiet. "He's going to fight it," he said. "Not a question. An observation." "He said he's going to write a letter," Mara said carefully. "That's the same thing with him." He turned his hat. "Is there anything I can do?" "You've been with the ranch for what, 3 years now?" "4, he said. "I may need you to write something, a statement about what you've seen here, how she's been cared for, what kind of home this is." She stopped. "You don't have to. I won't hold it against you if..." "You don't need to finish that sentence," he said. She looked at him. He was 20 years old, maybe 21, and he looked in that moment considerably older than that, certain in the way people got certain when something made the choice obvious. "All right," she said. "Thank you, Hitch." "I'll tell Glenn and Roy in the morning," he said. "Purdy, too." He stood up. "Purdy's going to be furious, just so you know. He gets protective and it comes out as angry." "I know," she said. "I know how he is." He put his hat on and went out to the bunkhouse, and Mara sat alone in the kitchen with the lamp burning down and the letter on the table in front of her and Lily asleep down the hall, and she let herself feel the fear that she'd been keeping in a closed room since the afternoon. It was considerable. The Holbrooks had money and lawyers and the standing of a Kansas family with a name. She had a letter and 15 cowboys and a ranch owner in Wyoming who'd written a letter to his foreman's brother. Whatever that amounted to in a courtroom, it was not obviously enough. She knew how these things went, had seen it happen to other women in other circumstances, the way legal machinery moved against people who didn't have the right kind of backing, grinding through the thing they were trying to protect. She reached out and put her hand flat on Claire's letter. "You're the only one I trust with this." She was not going to lose Lily. She had decided this the same way she'd decided everything else hard in her life. Not with confidence, because she didn't have that, but with a flat refusal that had nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with the fact that some things were not acceptable, and this was one of them. Botso. Silas came to her after breakfast the next morning with a different quality about him, the same deliberateness he always had, but with something beneath it that was more urgent. He closed the kitchen door, which he'd never done before, and turned to face her. "I heard back from Cole's brother," he said. "He responded last night by telegraph. He knows a man in Cheyenne, a federal practice, handles property and custody both. His name is Aldrich. He's good." "Expensive," she said. "Yes." "Silas!" "I'm not asking you to pay for it," he said. He said it plainly, not generously, the way you said things that were already decided. "I'm telling you what's available. Aldrich can be in Lander within 2 weeks if we wire him today. He'll need to see the letter from Clara, any other documentation you have, and—" He stopped, looked at her with the directness that was harder to receive when she was already feeling exposed. "He'll need to understand the arrangement here, what Lily's life looks like, why a judge in Wyoming should consider this her home." "And what do I tell him about that arrangement?" she asked. "Tell him the truth," Silas said, "that she's fed and warm and cared for, and that there are 15 men on this property who would walk into a courtroom and tell anyone who asked what kind of home she has here." She looked at him. "That's not nothing," she said. "No," he said, "it's not." She held his gaze for a moment, and she could feel the thing between them, that charged and careful distance, pulled tighter by the weight of what they were standing in the middle of. This was the part where fear and need and something she couldn't quite separate from either of those things converged into a moment that asked more of a person than a person usually had ready. She had to look away first because she was more tired than she was strong, and strength was what she needed right now. "Wire Aldrich," she said. "Tell him we need him as soon as he can come." Silas didn't move immediately. He stood there another moment with his hands at his sides, and the morning light coming through the kitchen window and the ranch going about its loud, cold business outside, and she felt him working through something. She could always tell when he was working through something, and then he said quietly, "I'm not going to let them take her." She looked back at him. He wasn't looking at her with promise or tenderness, or any of the soft things that statement might have carried from another kind of man. He said it the same way he said things about fences and water lines and the roof on the east stall, like a problem he'd identified and committed to solving, like a fact he was stating in advance of making it true. "Okay," she said. It was the most inadequate word she owned, and it was all she had, and she meant it completely. He gave one short nod and went back out into the cold, and the kitchen door swung behind him, and Mara pressed both hands flat on the counter and steadied herself against whatever was coming. Outside, Lily had woken in the basket in the sitting room and started making the small, insistent sounds that meant she wanted to be picked up, demanding without language, as confident as someone who had never once doubted they were worth the trouble of being held. Mara went to get her. Thomas Aldrich arrived on a Thursday in the second week of February, stepping off the stage from Lander in a coat that was too thin for Wyoming in February and carrying a leather satchel that looked like it had been halfway around the country and remembered all of it. He was somewhere around 50, compact and sharp-featured, with the kind of eyes that moved quickly and didn't stop moving, cataloging, assessing, filing things away. He shook Silas's hand at the stage stop and looked around at the town with the practiced neutrality of a man who had learned not to form opinions about places until he had to. Cole drove them back to the ranch in the wagon, and Aldrich spent the ride asking questions. Not of Silas, but mostly of the landscape, pointing at property lines and water sources, and asking how the county recorded title disputes, which was either extremely thorough background work or the habit of a man who thought better when his mouth was occupied. Mara met them at the door with coffee and Claire's letter already on the kitchen table. Aldrich sat down, took off his coat, picked up the letter, and read it without speaking. He read it twice. Then he set it down and looked at her over the top of his reading glasses. "Who were the witnesses?" he asked. "The boarding house owner, a woman named Ruth Garfield, and 2 residents, a seamstress named Dora Crane and a man named Bert Hollis who worked at the rail yard." "You have their full names." "I have their full names and the last address I knew for each of them." He looked at her with the brief, recalibrating attention of someone updating an assessment. Good, he said. That's good. He set down the letter. Tell me about the Holbrooks. I don't know them personally, she said. The letter from their attorneys is there, Graff and Hollis, of Topeka. From what I can gather, Everett Holbrook is Clara's mother's uncle. Clara never mentioned him. I don't know if they were estranged or if she simply had no relationship with that side. And the land. I didn't know about it until their letter. Aldrich nodded slowly, making notes on a small pad in handwriting that appeared to involve mostly abbreviations. The Holbrooks' claim is thin on family grounds, he said. A great-uncle by marriage twice removed is not close kin in any jurisdiction that would matter. What they have is the money argument, the land, the inheritance, the implication that you cannot provide adequately. He paused. Which brings me to the harder conversation. Mara kept her hands flat on the table. Go ahead. You are a single woman employed as a ranch cook with no biological or legal connection to this child. In a Kansas court, and they will try to bring this to Kansas, where they have standing and you don't. That is a difficult position. The letter from the mother helps. Witnesses to that letter help more. He looked at his notes. What helps most is the quality of the child's present circumstances. Her home, her care, the stability of her situation. He looked up at Silas. And the nature of your arrangement with Mr. Ashcroft. There was a brief silence. I employ Miss Ellison as cook and housekeeper, Silas said. She and the child have a room in the main house. They've been here since October. Aldrich looked between them with the expressionless efficiency of a man who had heard many versions of many arrangements and passed no judgment on any of them. A judge looking at this situation will draw certain inferences, he said. I'm not in the business of managing what people do in their private lives. I'm in the business of telling you what a judge sees and what arguments that creates for the other side. He paused. If there is a more formal arrangement, or the possibility of one, that changes the legal landscape considerably. Yiki. Man. Another silence. Mara looked at the table. I understand, Silas said. Good. Aldrich closed his pad. I'll need 3 days to review everything and send some wires. In the meantime, I want written statements from anyone on this property willing to provide them. Character, circumstances, quality of care. The more the better. He picked up his coffee. And I'll need the address of Ruth Garfield in Kansas City. The next 3 days moved at 2 speeds simultaneously. The slow grind of the ranch work, which did not pause for legal proceedings, and the fast-forward anxiety of everything happening around it. Aldrich spread papers across the dining room table and worked with a focus that impressed even Cole, who was not easily impressed. He sent wires and received them, conferred with Silas in the evenings, and took careful depositions from Hitch, Cole, Glenn, Roy, and finally Purdy, who sat across from the lawyer with the aggrieved dignity of a man who deeply resented being asked to speak well of someone he'd already decided he cared about. She's a good cook, Purdy said, when Aldrich asked him to describe Mara's care of the child. And the child? Aldrich prompted. Fed and clean and not crying when she don't need to be. That's more than you can say for a lot of situations I've seen. He crossed his arms. She talks to her, the baby, all day long while she's working. Tells her what she's doing, what things are. Like the girl's going to need to know the difference between baking soda and baking powder someday, and she's not starting too early. He paused. She pays attention to her. That's what I'm saying. She doesn't treat her like something to manage. Aldrich wrote this down, and Mara, who was pretending not to listen from the kitchen doorway, turned away before Purdy could catch her looking. It was Hitch who came to her that evening while she was washing up, standing in the kitchen with more hesitation than was usual for him. Aldrich told Silas something, he said, in private. I wasn't meant to hear it, but the door was open. He stopped. Tell me, she said. He said that even with all of it, the letter, the witnesses, the statements, a single woman without legal standing fighting a Kansas family with a Topeka law firm is not a good position. He said the strongest argument available is the stability of the child's present home, and that stability needs to look like more than a temporary employment situation. He looked at her carefully. I don't know what that means for you. I just thought you should know what he said. She dried her hands on her apron. Thank you, she said. He nodded and left, and she stood in the kitchen for a while after, with the fire burning down in the stove, and Lily asleep in her room, and the sound of Silas and Aldrich still talking in low voices in the dining room. She was not going to manufacture something for a courtroom. She had decided this firmly and without drama at some point in the last 3 days, the way she decided things that had a clear line between right and wrong. If the legal situation required a fiction to be solved, then the legal situation would have to be solved another way. She would not ask anything of Silas Ashcroft that came from a lawyer's assessment of what a judge needed to see. Whatever happened between them, if anything happened, it would be because it was true, not because it was useful. She went to bed and did not sleep well. Silas knocked on her door at 7 the following morning. She was already up. She was always up before this. And she opened it to find him in the hallway with his coat on, which meant he'd just come in from outside, and an expression that meant he'd decided something. Walk with me, he said. She put on her coat and followed him out. He walked her to the far side of the barn, where the wind was cut by the building and the morning light came in low and pale across the snow. He stopped and looked at the mountains for a moment, which she recognized as him finishing the thinking he'd started inside. I talked to Aldrich last night, he said, for a long time. I know. He looked at her. He told me the case is winnable. Genuinely. The witnesses, Clara's letter, the statements from the crew. He thinks if we can locate Ruth Garfield and get her testimony, the Holbrooks' claim weakens considerably because the legal document, Clara's letter, is specific and witnessed and dated before the family was even aware of the child. He paused. But he also said the strongest thing available to us is demonstrating that Lily has a permanent home. Not a job. A home. I know what he said, she said. Silas was quiet for a moment. I want you to know that what I'm about to say has nothing to do with Aldrich. She looked at him directly. I've been sitting with something since November, he said. And I've been sitting with it badly. Meaning, I've been trying to not sit with it, which is its own kind of sitting. He looked at the mountains again. I'm not good at this. There hasn't been a reason to be good at this for a long time, so I don't expect you to receive this as particularly... He stopped. Tried again. I'm 40 years old and I run a cattle ranch, and I haven't let myself want much of anything beyond the work in 8 years. And then you walked through my door in October in a blizzard with a baby and $11, and you didn't ask me for anything except a chance to show what you could do, and I... He stopped again. She waited. I'm asking you to marry me, he said. Not because Aldrich said it would help, because I've been wanting to ask you since December, and I've been too much of a coward to say it without the circumstances forcing the issue, and I'm tired of that. He turned to look at her fully. I know it's not a romantic proposal. I know this situation makes it complicated. I know you might think I'm doing it for the legal reason, and I don't know how to prove to you that I'm not, except to tell you plainly that I'm not, and ask you to believe me. Mara looked at him for a long moment. The cold pressed in around them, and the horses moved in the barn behind them, and somewhere across the property, Cole was shouting something at one of the younger hands, with the particular exasperation that cold mornings produced. I believe you, she said. Something in him eased. Not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who didn't know how to read him, but she did. I'm not easy to live with, she said. I have opinions about how kitchens should be run, and I will argue with you when I think you're wrong, and I will not stop doing either of those things because you asked me to. I know. And Lily is mine. Not mine by blood, but mine in every way that matters. That doesn't change, and it doesn't get negotiated. I know that too, he said. There was something in his voice when he said it, not resignation, not concession, but the voice of a man who had already decided and was being asked to confirm what he'd decided. She's been mine since about the second week of November, if I'm honest about it. Mara pressed her lips together and looked at the mountains because she needed a moment that was not directed at him. Yes, she said. All right. He exhaled once, short and controlled, which was Silas Ashcroft's version of relief. All right, he said. They stood there for a moment in the cold, both of them a little off balance in the way of people who had just changed the shape of their lives and were waiting for that to feel real. Then he reached out and covered her hand with his, briefly, the rough warmth of it, and let go. We should tell Aldrich, he said. We should, she agreed. They walked back to the house. Aldrich received the news with the measured approval of a man crossing an important item off a list, and within a day he had restructured his legal argument entirely. The letter from Clara stood at the center, unchanged, uncontested, the handwriting of a dying woman who had known exactly what she was doing. Around it he built a scaffold of testimony. Hitch, Cole, the brothers, Purdy, the boarding house witnesses, whom he'd tracked through the Kansas City directory with the methodical persistence of someone who expected obstacles and didn't take them personally. Ruth Garfield, it turned out, was still in Kansas City and still at the same address, and wrote back to Aldrich's wire within 24 hours. I remember Clara Voss clearly. I remember the letter. I will say so to anyone who asks. Dora Crane was found through the Seamstress Guild. Bert Hollis, the rail yard man, had moved to Omaha but was located through a cousin. 3 witnesses. A witness letter. And now a household. A ranch with a name and a deed and a man willing to put both against whatever the Holbrooks could throw. They'll fight it, Aldrich said, the evening before he left for Cheyenne to file the formal response. He was at the dining room table with Silas across from him and Mara at the end, Lily on her lap. Graff and Hollis are not an incompetent firm. They'll argue that the marriage is expedient, that the arrangement was manufactured for litigation purposes. We'll counter with the timeline. The affidavits from the crew predate any knowledge of the claim, and Miss Ellison, he corrected himself. Mrs. Ashcroft-to-be was established here well before the letter arrived. What's your honest assessment? Silas asked. Aldrich looked at him steadily. Honest assessment is that the Holbrooks want the land, not the child. Their claim to Lily is leverage for the inheritance. They want someone in their family managing that parcel. If Lily's custody is secured in a Wyoming court with an established household and documented guardianship, the Kansas claim for the land becomes a separate legal matter with a trustee rather than a family member at issue. And that is a fight they're less interested in having. He paused. They may push this to a hearing. They may not. It depends how much they want the land versus how much trouble they're willing to go through for it. And if they push it to a hearing? Mara asked. Then we go to a hearing and we win, Aldrich said. Not arrogantly, just with the flat confidence of a man assessing odds he'd spent a week calculating. The letter from Clara Voss is specific, witnessed, and legally coherent. 3 independent witnesses will confirm its authenticity. A stable, established household with documented community ties, and a forthcoming marriage argues strongly for permanence of arrangement. He closed his file. They are going to argue that a cattle ranch in Wyoming is no place to raise a girl child. We are going to argue that a family that didn't know this child existed 8 months ago has no credible interest in her welfare as opposed to her inheritance. He looked at Lily. And we are going to note that this child is healthy, thriving, and by all available accounts deeply embedded in a community that has chosen her as deliberately as she has been chosen by it. Lily, as if to demonstrate this point, reached across the table toward Aldrich's pen with complete confidence that reaching for things generally worked out. He moved it out of range with the automatic reflexes of someone who had grandchildren. "Wire me when you have a date from Graff and Hollis," he said. "If they respond with a hearing request, we'll move quickly. If they don't respond within 30 days, I'll file the formal guardianship petition in Fremont County, and we proceed on our terms." He stood, gathered his papers. "In the meantime, the marriage." "Soon," Silas said. "Before any hearing date," Aldrich confirmed. He looked at Mara. "And Miss Ellison, if you have any other documentation. Letters from Clara, anything she gave you, photographs, anything that establishes the relationship over time." "I have letters," Mara said. 5 or 6, from before Lily was born. Clara wrote to me when I was in Denver for 3 months before I came back to Kansas City." Aldrich paused. "Those letters establish a sustained relationship predating the child's birth. That is, yes. Keep those safe and send copies to my office." He picked up his satchel. "You have a strong case, Miss Ellison. You were good parents to that child before you had any legal framework for it. Courts tend to notice that." He shook hands with Silas, nodded to Mara, and went to find Cole to drive him back to town. The dining room was quiet after he left. Mara looked at the table, the rings where coffee cups had been, the paper edges, Lily's small handprint in the dust at the table's corner where she'd been propped earlier. 5 or 6 letters, Silas said. Clara was a good correspondent, Mara said. Before she got very sick, she wrote twice a month. Long letters. She talked about everything, what she was reading, what the weather was doing, what the other residents of the boarding house were like. She paused. She talked about Lily before Lily existed. She had names picked out at 5 months. She had opinions about how children should be raised, what they should be taught. She stopped. She sounds like someone who would have been good at it, Silas said. She would have been extraordinary at it, Mara said. The weight of that was an old weight now, worn smooth by months of carrying it, but it still had its gravity. That's the part I think about, how much she would have loved seeing her walk. The fiddle music in December, Clara loved music. She would have... She stopped. Silas didn't try to fix it. He just sat with her in it, which was what the moment needed, and which was something she'd come to understand about him. That he knew the difference between grief that wanted comfort and grief that wanted company. After a while, Lily leaned back from Mara's lap and looked up at the ceiling with an expression of deep personal satisfaction about something no one else could identify, and the weight shifted, as it always did with her. The Holbrooks' response came 3 weeks later. Graff and Hollis filed a formal hearing request in Fremont County, not Kansas, which told Aldrich everything he needed to know about how their legal assessment had shifted when they saw his filing. They'd chosen the harder terrain, which meant they'd looked at a Kansas hearing and decided the math was worse there than they'd thought. Aldrich's wire to Silas said simply, "They filed in Wyoming. That's good news. Prepare for March." The ranch absorbed this information the way it absorbed most things, by continuing. Cole told the crew that there would be some legal proceedings coming and that statements might be needed, and the crew's response was a unanimous collective uninterest in the Holbrook family's opinions, expressed in the colorful terms that working cowboys used when they decided something wasn't worth their patience. Purdy summarized the general sentiment at supper the evening after Aldrich's wire arrived, setting down his fork and addressing the table with the gravity of a man issuing a formal position. Bunch of people from Kansas who didn't know this baby existed 6 months ago want to decide what's good for her. He picked his fork back up. They're going to have a hard time at it. The table made sounds of agreement. "Eat your supper," Mara said from the kitchen doorway, and they did. That night, after the house was quiet, and Lily was down and the last lamp in the kitchen was burning low, Silas found Mara at the table with Clara's letters spread in front of her, not reading them, just looking at them. The handwriting that she'd read so many times it had become part of the furniture of her mind. He sat down across from her. "How are you doing?" he asked. "Not are you all right?" He'd learned early that she deflected that question automatically. "How are you doing?" was specific enough to require a real answer. She thought about it. "Scared," she said, "in the way where you know the fear isn't useful, but you can't put it down." "Yeah," he said, and she stopped. Tried again. "Grateful," which feels strange to say in the middle of something like this. But I look around this kitchen, and I think about where Lily and I were 6 months ago, and she shook her head. "I didn't think it would look like this. I didn't think there would be people. I thought it was going to be the two of us, just holding on." He looked at her for a moment. "It's not just the two of you," he said. "No," she said, "it's not." The lamp guttered once and steadied. Outside, the February wind moved around the house with its nightly inventory, finding the corners, checking the eaves, the same wind that had been there since October and would be there until spring decided to make its slow appearance. They sat there together in the kitchen with the letters between them and the fire in the stove ticking down, and somewhere down the hall Lily sleeping with the absolute abandon of a child who had no idea that 3 states away a law firm was trying to argue she belonged somewhere else, and felt none of the fear that the adults around her were carrying because the world she knew had never given her reason to doubt that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The hearing was set for the 14th of March. Aldrich arrived 2 days before with a leather case so full of documents it wouldn't close properly, and he spent those 2 days at the dining room table in a state of focused intensity that kept even Cole from interrupting him unnecessarily. He had located all 3 Kansas City witnesses. Ruth Garfield had agreed to travel to Cheyenne at Aldrich's firm's expense and provide live testimony. Dora Crane and Bert Hollis had submitted sworn affidavits, notarized and filed. He had Clara's letter, Clara's letters to Mara from Denver, and the written statements of 9 men currently employed at Blackstone Ranch. What he didn't have yet was the Holbrook's full argument, which Graff and Hollis had been strategic about disclosing. He suspected he knew the shape of it. He was right. The hearing was held in the Fremont County Courthouse in Lander, a 2-story building that smelled like wood polish and cold and the specific variety of anxiety that courtrooms produced in people regardless of their guilt or innocence. Silas had hired a second chair from Cheyenne to sit with Aldrich, a younger man named Prentice, who was fast with documents and knew the local judges. Mara sat beside Silas in the gallery with Lily on her lap, because Aldrich had advised her to bring the child, and she'd understood why without needing it explained. The Holbrooks were already seated when they arrived. Everett Holbrook was a heavy-set man in his late 60s with a prosperous face and the kind of suit that said money without shouting it. His wife Nadine was smaller, sharp-featured, dressed in traveling clothes that were too formal for a Wyoming courtroom in March. Their attorney, a man named Graff, the senior partner, not the junior, sat between them with the contained confidence of someone who'd done this particular kind of hearing many times before. Everett Holbrook looked at Lily once, across the room. There was nothing warm in it. It was the look of a man looking at a parcel of property he intended to recover. Mara turned Lily slightly away from him, not dramatically, just enough, and fixed her eyes on the judge's bench. What? Judge Carver was 61 years old, Wyoming-born, and had been presiding over Fremont County for 19 years. Aldrich had told them he was fair, thorough, and specifically impatient with what he called imported arguments, legal theories developed in one state and applied to another with the assumption that geography didn't matter. He read both filings before he said a word, which took 12 minutes, during which the courtroom was quiet except for Lily, who made occasional investigative sounds at the ceiling that Mara muffled against her shoulder. Graff presented first. His argument was smooth and well-constructed and said almost nothing about Lily directly, which was telling. He spoke at length about the land, $4,300 in assessed value, eastern Kansas, left in the child's name through a property settlement by her biological father. He spoke about the Holbrook family's standing in Topeka, their property, their household, their capacity to provide. He spoke about Mara's legal status. No blood relation, no formal adoption, no legal instrument of custody except a handwritten letter from a woman who was deceased and could not be cross-examined. He used the phrase informal arrangement 4 times in 15 minutes. He did not say Mara was a bad caretaker. He was too careful for that. He implied it entirely through structure, through the language of what was appropriate, what was suitable, what a child of means and inheritance deserved as a foundation for her life. Aldrich let him finish without interrupting. Then he stood up. He started with Ruth Garfield. Ruth Garfield was 63 years old, broad-shouldered, with gray hair pinned severely back, and the bearing of a woman who had run a boarding house for 30 years and developed a comprehensive intolerance for nonsense in all its forms. She took the witness chair as though she'd been expecting to sit in it for some time and had opinions about its construction. Aldrich walked her through it slowly and methodically. She described Clara Voss, her tenancy, her illness, her character. She described Mara's presence in the boarding house, the relationship between the 2 women, the nature of it. She described the night Clara's letter was written. She asked you to witness it, Aldrich said. Clara Voss. What did she say to you when she asked? Ruth Garfield folded her hands on the railing. She said she needed it done right. She said she'd thought about it for weeks, and she'd decided Mara was the only person she trusted with Lily, and she wanted it written and witnessed so there wasn't any question later. She paused. I asked her if she had family who should be considered. She said she had some family somewhere, but that family and people who would actually take care of her daughter were not the same thing, and she wasn't leaving Lily to people who'd shown up now that there was something worth showing up for. A silence in the courtroom. Graff objected to the last sentence as hearsay. Judge Carver overruled him with the look of a man who had already heard enough to know what he thought. Aldrich presented the Denver letters next. 6 of them, each dated, each addressed to Mara, each signed by Clara. He read 3 passages aloud, not for drama, but for the simple, factual weight of them. A woman who had known Mara for a year before Lily was born, who had trusted her with the ordinary texture of her life, who had written about her daughter-to-be, and the person she'd already chosen to help raise her. The relationship was not improvised. It was not expedient. It had a history. Graff cross-examined briefly and without much force. His case had been built on the premise that Mara's claim was thin and improvised, and the letters did significant damage to that premise. Then Aldrich called Silas. Silas took the witness chair with the particular quality he brought to everything: unhurried, unperformative, the manner of a man who had nothing to prove and knew it. Aldrich asked him direct questions, and he gave direct answers. How long had Mara and Lily been at the ranch? What were the circumstances of their arrival? What was the nature of the household? How was the child cared for? What was the character of the arrangement? "You're engaged to be married," Aldrich said, "to Miss Ellison." "Yes." "When did you decide that?" Silas looked at him. "February," he said, "before I knew this hearing had been filed." "Why February?" A pause. Silas looked at his hands for a moment, then back up. "Because I'd been planning to ask her since December, and I kept finding reasons not to. The hearing pushed me to stop finding reasons." Aldrich nodded. "Was the decision to propose connected to the legal proceedings?" "The decision to stop putting it off was connected to the proceedings," Silas said. "The decision itself was not." Aldrich sat down. Graff stood for cross-examination. He was careful with Silas. You could see him being careful, recalibrating in real time, because Silas was not a witness who offered anything extra, and Graff knew better than to push a Wyoming rancher on his own testimony in a Wyoming courthouse. He tried the angle of convenience. Wasn't it true that the engagement provided legal advantage in this matter? And Silas said yes, it provided legal advantage, and that was not the reason for it, and the two things could both be true at once. Graff tried a different angle. "Mr. Ashcroft, you knew nothing about this child before October of last year." "That's right. You had no prior relationship with Miss Ellison." "No. You hired her as a cook." "Yes. And now, 4 months later, you're engaged to marry her and prepared to raise a child you have no biological or legal connection to." He paused for effect. "That's quite a significant change in your circumstances." Silas looked at him with the flat patience of a man waiting for a question. "Is there a question?" he said. A small sound from somewhere in the gallery. Judge Carver didn't move, but something around his eyes shifted fractionally. Graff rephrased. "Isn't it possible that this entire arrangement, the engagement, the claim of a settled household, has been constructed specifically to defeat my client's claim?" "No," Silas said. "How would you ask the court to distinguish between a genuine commitment and an expedient one?" Silas was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was slowly, in the considered way of someone who was going to say something true and wanted to get it right. "I lost my wife and my son 8 years ago," he said. "After that, I ran my ranch and I kept to myself, and I didn't let myself want much because wanting things had cost me more than I could afford to lose twice." He stopped. "Mara Ellison walked through my door with $11 and a baby in a blizzard, and she didn't ask me for anything except a chance to work. She ran my kitchen, and she fed my men, and she built something in that house that hadn't been there in a long time." He looked at Graff steadily. "I'm not a man who makes decisions for convenience. I made this one because it was the only thing I wanted to do, and I was too slow about it, and I'm not going to stand up in front of a judge and pretend otherwise." "Shapir? C'est-moi qui is..." The courtroom was quiet. Graff sat down. Aldrich did not call Mara to testify. He told her beforehand that he didn't need to, and she'd trusted his judgment. Instead, he submitted the crew's affidavits as a collective exhibit, 9 statements, each describing the same household, each independent, each consistent in its picture of a child who was fed and held and talked to and loved by a woman who had given up everything she had to keep a promise to a friend. He made his closing argument in 11 minutes. He did not raise his voice. He did not use the word justice, which he considered sentimental in a courtroom. He used the word evidence 6 times and the word record 4 times, and he ended with this. The Holbrook family became aware of Lily Voss's existence when they became aware of her inheritance. The record contains no evidence of prior contact, prior concern, or prior relationship. The record contains extensive evidence of a woman who has cared for this child since her 2nd week of life, who has a documented relationship with the child's biological mother predating Lily's birth, and whose guardianship was specifically and clearly requested in a witnessed legal document. The question before this court is not which household is wealthier, it is which claim is legitimate. The answer is in the record. Judge Carver recessed for 40 minutes. Mara sat in the hallway with Lily in her lap and Silas beside her, and did not talk because there was nothing useful to say. Hitch sat across from her, and Cole and Roy, who had driven the second wagon from the ranch that morning without being asked and arrived before the hearing started. Purdy was there too, at the end of the bench, sitting with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who considered the whole proceeding an imposition on his time that would obviously resolve correctly. 40 minutes. Lily fell asleep. The bailiff opened the door. Judge Carver read his ruling without preamble. The Holbrook claim for guardianship was denied. The evidence supported the validity of Clara Voss's letter as a legally coherent expression of parental intent. The 3 independent witnesses confirmed its authenticity. The documented household at Blackstone Ranch demonstrated sustained, stable, and demonstrably appropriate care. The forthcoming marriage of Mara Ellison to Silas Ashcroft further established permanence of circumstance. Regarding the land inheritance, a trustee arrangement would be established under Wyoming jurisdiction to manage the Kansas parcel until Lily Voss reached the age of majority. The Holbrook family was not named as trustee. Aldrich had recommended a Cheyenne bank for this purpose, and the judge accepted it without comment. Guardianship of Lily Ann Voss was formally granted to Mara Ellison, to be reviewed at the time of marriage and updated accordingly. Graff said something to Everett Holbrook in a low voice. Holbrook sat with his hands flat on the table in the expression of a man running calculations. His wife touched his arm. He didn't look at Lily. He didn't look at Mara. He stood up and put on his coat and walked out of the courtroom, and that was the last Mara ever saw of him. She sat very still for a moment after the ruling. Silas's hand found hers under the table. Not dramatically, not for anyone to see, just his hand over hers, brief and warm and certain. "Okay," she said, to no one in particular, just to the room. Lily slept through all of it. They married on the first Saturday of May, not because May was particularly symbolic, but because the weather had finally come around and the road was dry enough for a wagon, and the justice of the peace in Lander had a Saturday opening, and Mara owned one dress that was not work clothes, a blue wool she'd bought secondhand in Kansas City and kept wrapped in paper in the bottom of her suitcase for circumstances she hadn't been able to specify at the time. It turned out this was the circumstance. The whole crew came. They wore their cleanest clothes and stood in a loose congregation in the county office with their hats in their hands and the particular formality of working men who had decided an occasion required something of them. Hitch had combed his hair. Roy had shined his boots. Purdy wore a jacket that had fit him better 20 years ago and stood in the back with his arms crossed and the expression of someone attending an event they would deny having feelings about. Cole stood as Silas's witness. Mara had no one for that role in the conventional sense, and so she'd asked Ruth Garfield by letter, who had written back, "I'll be there. Don't make the ceremony too long." She arrived the Friday before by stage, greeted Mara with a handshake, and Lily with a look of intense personal satisfaction, and told Silas within the first hour of meeting him that he seemed sensible, which she delivered as a high compliment. The ceremony took 11 minutes. The justice of the peace had a slight cold and moved quickly. Silas said his part in the steady, unembellished way he said everything important. Mara said hers and did not cry, because she'd decided she wasn't going to, and she was good at deciding things, though it cost her something at the moment he put the ring on her hand. A plain band, worked from silver, that he'd had made in Lander by a man who knew what he was doing. Lily, held by Ruth Garfield during the ceremony, made a sustained and interested sound at the ring that made several of the cowboys laugh, which broke the solemnity in the right the way solemnity needed occasionally to be broken so it didn't tip into something too heavy to bear. Afterward, they drove back to the ranch and Mara made supper for 20 people. The crew plus Ruth, who insisted on helping and turned out to be useful in a kitchen, which Mara respected. And they ate until the food was gone, and Hitch played the fiddle better than he ever had, and Roy danced with no particular skill and considerable enthusiasm, and even Cole was seen to smile twice, which Hitch later claimed was a record. Purdy sat with Lily on his knee for most of the evening, pointing at things and naming them in his low, unhurried voice. The fiddle, the lamp, the window, the stars outside it, which Lily could not yet see, but he named for her anyway with the same seriousness he brought to fences and water troughs, because Purdy had decided the world should be named for her correctly and from the beginning, and he was not a man who did things halfway once he'd decided to do them. Spring arrived in its practical, unsentimental Wyoming fashion. Mud before green, wind before warmth, the mountains giving up their snow slowly and without apology. The cattle work intensified the way it did every April, pulling the crew out from the long interior winter into the loud, necessary work of the land. Lily began to walk in the last week of April, about a week before the wedding. She'd been threatening to for days, standing at the kitchen table, releasing her grip, taking one step before sitting down in the deliberate way she had of quitting while she was ahead. Then on a Tuesday afternoon, while Mara was working at the stove and not watching, Lily simply stood up in the middle of the kitchen floor and walked to Silas, who was sitting at the table with the account books. With the unhurried purposefulness of someone who had decided it was time and saw no reason to make a drama of it, he put down the accounts. He looked at her. This small, determined person who had walked into his kitchen in October in a blizzard and changed everything about the shape of his life without asking permission. And she reached both hands up at him with the absolute certainty of someone who had never once doubted she was going to be picked up. He picked her up. He held her for a long moment with his chin on the top of her head, and Mara watched from the stove and said nothing and turned back to what she was making and blinked once, twice, at the middle distance. Some things didn't need words. Most of the things that mattered, actually. That was something you learned, if you lived long enough and paid attention to the right moments. That the events which changed the shape of a life rarely announced themselves. They arrived as ordinary Tuesdays, as small children walking across kitchen floors, as strangers who knocked on doors in blizzards and didn't leave. By summer, Blackstone Ranch had developed a reputation in the valley that had nothing to do with cattle prices or fence lines. People talked about it the way people talk about places that have a quality they can't quite categorize. Something they noticed when they stopped there, or sent a hand there, or heard about from someone else. The bread was always baking before sunrise. The coffee was always hot. A traveler who came through in bad weather and needed a meal got one. No transaction required. A neighboring rancher whose cook quit mid-season sent 2 men to ask if Mara had any suggestions and found himself at the kitchen table for an hour, going home with a list of names and a jar of preserved peaches and the slightly dazed expression of a man who hadn't expected to be taken care of. It was not charity exactly. It didn't have the self-consciousness of charity. It was just, that was how the place ran. That was what Mara did, because it was what she knew to do with a space that needed tending, and she'd been doing it since October, and by summer it had become the character of the ranch the way a person's habits become their character over time. Silas watched it happen and said almost nothing about it, which was his version of deep approval. One evening in July, late, after the crew was in the bunkhouse and Lily was down and the kitchen was clean, he found Mara on the porch watching the dark come down over the mountains. He came out and stood beside her, and they were quiet for a while in the comfortable way of people who had learned each other's silences. "You know what Hitch told me today," she said. "What?" "He said his mother might come out for a visit in the fall. He said he'd been writing her about the ranch and she wanted to see it." She paused. "He said he used to feel like he was just working somewhere, that now he feels like he lives somewhere." Silas was quiet for a moment. "He does," he said. She looked at the mountains. The last light was the particular amber of high summer evenings, the kind of light that made everything look like it had been there a very long time and would be there much longer. The barn, the bunkhouse, the fences Silas had built and repaired and built again over 14 years. All of it ordinary and solid and real. She thought about a boarding house in Kansas City and a woman who had laughed at things other people missed and written long letters about a daughter who didn't exist yet, and trusted the one person she could find who wouldn't treat love like a burden. She thought about $11 in a coat pocket and a stage road going soft in October mud and a door that had almost been closed before she said the right thing. She thought about what it cost sometimes to stay and what it cost not to. The things that broke you and the things that built you were not always different things. That was what she knew now that she hadn't known at 26, standing in that boarding house room with a letter and a baby and no idea what she was walking into. That survival and love were not opposites, that sometimes they were the same motion, pointing the same direction, asking the same thing of you. Stay, keep going. Don't decide in advance that the door isn't worth knocking on. Silas's hand found hers on the porch railing. Neither of them spoke. Inside, Lily slept in her room with the wooden horse on the windowsill where it always was, worn smooth now from being handled, the letters and numbers on the blocks spread across the floor where she'd left them. The ranch made its sounds around them. The horses settling, the wind, the particular creak of a house that had been built to last by a man who had built it for someone, and kept it going after she was gone, and finally, slowly, let someone back into it. It wasn't a perfect place. It was a cold place, a hard place, a place where things went wrong with the regularity of anywhere that asked real work of the people in it. The fences still needed fixing. The left burner on the stove still ran hot. Purdy still had opinions about everything, and Hitch still talked too much. And Cole still communicated primarily in functional brevity, and Roy still couldn't dance, and none of that was going to change. But the bread was always baking before sunrise. The coffee never ran cold. And every stranger who knocked on that door from that summer onward was welcomed in. Because that was what the place had become. And that was what the people in it had decided to be. And some decisions once made have a way of outlasting the circumstances that made them necessary. The mountains held the last of the light. The valley went dark. The ranch kept its warmth.